Now, we've seen what value chains are. I argue that they matter a lot to understand a number of different things. They're relevant to explore the opportunities that value chains open to local firms and suppliers for their upgrading and innovation. Let us discuss a bit more in details the relationship that I see between value chains and innovation, and specifically part of the lecture will be on the relationship between innovation systems and global value chains. The first thing I would like to say, this is drawn from a paper published in World Development 2011, where we started discussing the relationship between value chains and innovation systems with my colleague Roberta Rabellotti. And the big question we had in mind was, how does it matter for local suppliers to be part of a value chain in terms of the implications for their learning and innovation processes? And we used the governance typology developed by Guereffi and others that I was presenting a while ago, and started exploring to what extent different learning mechanisms can apply within the value chain in the different forms of governance. And the table summarizes a lot of this research. And as you see, there's different ways through which a value chain integration can influence learning. And I see learning as intrinsically related to innovation. So learning is not something different, it's something that is relevant for any innovation activity at the firm level. And you see that, for example, whilst in the traditional market-based form of governance of inter-firm transactions, the typical mechanisms that allow learning are either spillovers or simply outright imitation. For a form of a value chain like a modular value chain, think of the auto industry or the electronic sector, there's a learning that is made possible through the pressure to accomplish standards. If a firm in any country wanted to become a supplier of a big auto company, Hyundai or Honda or Ford or whatever, or Volkswagen, then they need to fulfill international standards. And the mere fact of having to comply with these standards represents a pressure to learn, a pressure to innovate. And standards also embody a lot of technology, a lot of knowledge. Just complying with the standards and understanding what the standards are about and understanding how to comply with the standards also allows firms to get access to huge amounts of knowledge and information. And in relational value chains, on top of some of these elements, there's also this remarkable possibility of mutual learning through face-to-face interaction that is possible and necessary whenever the form of governance prevailing in the value chain is relational. And in some cases, there can be a deliberate process of transferring knowledge and fostering learning and innovation in supplier firms that can be promoted by lead firms. So this may happen in a value chain, though this is often limited to a very selected and narrow range of functions and activities. But if we try to move to the specific issue of innovation and innovation systems and its relationship with the global value chain, first of all, we need to say that it is a topic that has often been neglected in the literature. This is a study that tried to analyze, it's a bibliometric study trying to see to what extent in various publications scientific academic publications, the different terminology which is associated to on the horizontal axis, you see on innovation systems, internet, sectoral, local, national innovation systems, and interaction, trust, relationships, the typical terminology associated to innovation systems, and also the terminology related to value chains. You see that the intersection often occurs with the dark black cells, so innovation systems and geography with innovation systems per se, and a few others, but the value chain, global value chain, innovation system interaction is very poorly populated. Very few papers have been addressing these issues at once. And let me try to introduce how I see that these two elements, these two approaches to the literature can be organized together, and they can be conceptualized as mutually interacting. Let's try to use this diagram that we have here, where you see the centerpiece is what happens within firms, the process of learning, the process of capability development. We can talk about innovation or capability development. It can be technological or innovation capability. I will not go into the details of what the specifics of this, but you know, this process of innovation and learning at the firm level, which we know, and the literature has confirmed, is fostered by the working of innovation systems. So this is what the innovation systems has been stating many times. A strong innovation system, look at this arrow with this light blue arrow, would influence positively the development of learning and innovation at the firm level. And we've also seen that global value chains controlling for governance, so a favorable governance of a value chain would itself influence the process of learning and innovation at the firm level. This is well known. This is well established in the literature. So these are relationships that have been demonstrated with a lot of empirical literature. But at the same time, there's also what we call feedback flows, the dark blue arrows. The process of capability development and stronger capabilities in firms is likely to have a positive impact on the strength of the innovation system as well. More capable, more innovative firms will demand a better functioning innovation system, and better firms with stronger innovation capabilities will likely generate remarkable externalities, whereby the sum of the capabilities made available by capable firms would amount to a larger entity and would therefore strengthen the innovation system. So we have a feedback flow in this sense. And we also know from part of the literature that firms with stronger capabilities would also influence the governance of global value chains, and value chain leaders will likely choose more relational value chains and more relational forms of governance of value chains whenever they find local firms that are more capable and better endowed with innovation and learning capabilities. What I'm aiming at is showing that the relationship between value chains and innovation systems and the impact on innovation and learning at the firm level is multifold. There's mutual influences, there's a lot of feedbacks, there's multiple directions in these relationships, which would lead us to think that there is a co-evolution process in place. There's a phenomenon that is developing simultaneously in one direction and the opposite, with these different dimensions that interact. And what we try to explore in a specific paper, which is one of the 4 papers that I highlighted as possible references for this lecture, is that we considered a very specific sector, the ICT sector, the software and hardware, and we tried to answer the big question on whether innovation systems and value chain integration interact and how they eventually co-evolve. And if we, for the sake of simplicity, we think of an innovation system that is getting stronger or getting weaker, and value chains that are, and firms in value chains that are deepening their integration. So firms more and more choose the form of organizational production represented by a value chain, or they rather withdraw and they operate following a different method, a different organization and system. We have 4 possibilities. So we have the possibility of a deepening integration in value chains with stronger and getting stronger innovation systems. We have the opposite with withdrawing, delinking from value chains and weakening innovation systems, and 2 intermediate solutions. So a deepening integration in chains, as well as a weakening of the innovation system, and the opposite, that is withdrawing whilst the innovation system is strengthening. We try to associate this to the evolution of capabilities in firms. And based on secondary evidence, we managed to illustrate 4 different context-specific trajectories relating firms' innovation capabilities over time, and trying to explain this with the co-evolution of the innovation system and the governance of the value chain. And you see that the most promising trajectories are A and B, where in A there's a constant and gradual improvement in all dimensions, and firms' innovation capabilities improve. Whereas with B, there's a process of improvement in capabilities. There's what has been called in and out. So firms get access to value chains, then get out, and then strengthen their innovation capabilities and get into value chains again. And the other 2 that are rather negative, with an initial improvement in capabilities, and here with D, a constant decrease and worsening of the situation of local firms. Let me jump to the specific question of this empirical paper that we published very recently. The big questions are summarized here. This the hypothesis of a co-evolution of GVC integration and strength of the innovation system, and whether the integration and value chain is helping the process of catching up in innovation capacity in firms. And we did this by looking at a specific sector, the ITC sector, that if considered as one unique sector, would be hiding the 2 very different realities. Indeed, in the computer electronics, we observe a decreasing process of value chain integration. So firms are increasingly choosing different forms of organizational production, different from the value chain. And as far as the software sector is concerned, we observed exactly the opposite. Over a period of 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, using data from the OECD for 64 countries, for this sector, we observed that in software, the extent of integration into value chains has been increasing. So we see that the average is more or less constant, but the trends of these 2 sectors are totally different. How can we explain this? What's the mechanism behind? Is there a process of I mean, is this being explained, and is this going to have an effect on local firms' capabilities? We measured GVC integration for 45 countries for these two sectors by using the traditional methods of the traditional measures of GVC integration or GVC participation, integration or participation. I'm using the two terms as synonyms. And there's a well-known paper by Borin and Mancini that measures the extent of GVC integration. And then we use the patents and essentially patents deposited at the US Patent Office. And we measure the relative strength of the sector innovation system, measuring the extent of patents specific to the two sectors as a percentage of the population, controlling for the population, to see and gather with that the implied strength of the sector innovation system as reflected by the patenting activities related to the industry. And we applied this to these two industries, and we observe very, very different and very interesting results. These are simple correlations, and the pattern of coevolution tends to vary remarkably by sector. We see that in the hardware sector, let yourselves be guided by the colors. So you see this bright blue, and you see in the hardware sector, there's first of all a process of decreasing integration in value chains. You see the negative correlation term, which is statistically significant. In spite of the high initial levels and the high levels that are still high after 10 years, but the trend is clearly towards a diminishing integration in value chains. We see at the same time that, look at the yellow, that a process of changing in value chain integration is related to an impoverishment of the sectoral innovation system, a negative correlation between deepening integration and the strength of the innovation system. Whereas, look at the green, the software sector reveals a totally different pattern of transformation with the increasing value chain integration positively and significantly related to the changing strength of the sectoral innovation system. And finally, we also observe a lot of path dependence. In software, the sectoral innovation systems improves over time, and also high levels of an improvement in sector innovation system strength is also related to a deepening value chain integration. We also used cluster analysis to try to group countries according to their similarities in terms of their levels of sectoral systems of innovation, the integration in value chains in the two different sectors. And we managed to obtain a variety of different clusters with countries grouping in each of these clusters. And we see it's probably easier to see it in a diagram like this. We singled out trajectories of the coevolution of sectoral innovation systems and value chain integrations for software over this period of time. And there's one sector where there's a positive reinforcement of both the sector innovation system and the deepening of the GVC participation, which is clearly, and the countries that most remarkable countries in these clusters are Ireland, Israel, and the US, that are among the largest software producers in the world. And we also see that there are other patterns of coevolution as highlighted by the S2, S3, and S4 clusters. and similar results, but very different in terms of the actual content of the results, but similar in terms of the method and the visualization, are the results we obtained for hardware, where we managed to obtain 4 different clusters. And in cluster H1, which is the blue one, we see that the sector innovation system is getting stronger in spite of, thanks to the decreasing integration in value chains. This is the case of countries such as Finland, Israel, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the US, where this appears to signal that the system is growing thanks to efforts that do not depend or do not rely on value chain integration, but they depend on the inner forces strengthening the innovation system in these sectors. Whereas in others, you see, look at H2, for example, you have a slightly diminishing sector innovation system strength with an increasing in GVC participation, following perhaps a traditional form of GVC integration, more related to the need to save on costs in different segments of production, whilst the innovation capacity of the sector in the country does not appear to be improving over time. And in sum, if I were to summarize, and you have here there's a reference to a little blog that we published recently, where we discuss the main results of this paper. We found evidence that there's a mutually influencing evolution of value chain integration and innovation system strength for the ICT sector. And there are remarkable differences within the sector and across the sectors. And what we also observe is that there's a strong cumulativeness in innovation capacity building. So we don't see countries jumping from one group to the other and strongly developing their sector innovation system without starting with a relatively strong innovation system. There's a lot of path dependence, a lot of cumulative processes in developing and strengthening innovation systems. That's one step in this direction. Of course, there's much research that needs to be done by looking at the co-evolution, looking at this was, for example, so only sectoral and country level evidence. It would be incredible to be able to look at firm level evidence and also. Is it me? I couldn't hear anything. Was this a question?
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't. Was it myself being repeated? For some reason with a delay? Or was just an interference?
Yeah, just an interference.
All right. Okay. No, forget it. Now, I don't know whether you have a specific question on this or the linkages between innovation and value chains, because the next and final part of the presentation would be a few ideas on policies and how and what GVC-oriented policies mean, and the proposal to classify them and so on. But perhaps you have some curiosity or some opinions on innovation and value chains, or some request for clarification.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Because we are supposed, I think we discussed this already, but we are supposed to prepare like a project by the end of the month, talking about exactly about innovation and global value change. And yes, when I was looking for papers, I could find what you were mentioning, that there are not so many papers that are talking about these two topics together. And also I found that there has been probably like an increase, maybe in the last 2-3 years. I could find a lot of new papers on the topic. And I wanted to ask your opinion, like, where do you see, like, do you think there will be, do you think this area of knowledge is growing how do you see the future of this area, or yeah, something like this?
Yeah, are you planning to write a thesis on this, if I may?
No, not at all.
No, but I think the field is getting crowded. There's a lot of people looking at this and exploring. This we're living in a digital age. We're living in an age of increasing disruptions to international trade. We're still in this terrible pandemic period. So value chains are changing. They are subject to restructuring. Their impact on countries' development, upgrading, learning, innovation is important to study and understand. And I'm convinced that this is a field that is going to be studied more and more. And one of the reasons why it was not studied so far that much is that the data set on value chains and value chain integration has been very, very limited. We only have data at the national level for 50, 60 countries, depending on the OECD data sets, have data on 60 something countries. UNCTAD has something that is more limited in depth, but covering a larger number of countries. And firm level data that would be required to analyze more and more these issues is hardly available. There's very few countries that have firm level data documenting integration in value chains and the level of innovative capabilities in firms and so on. So the more data gets produced and accessible, the more the field will expand, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome. Shall I continue?
Yes, sure.
Hello, Professor.
Yes, please.
I have a question because what topics do you think are important in the GVC space? And could you recommend some important articles or journals to us? Thank you, Professor.
If you want to start from the very basics, there's a handbook of global value chains that is quoted in my references. I gave 4 references. Maybe I can show you. We went very fast in that, but I will leave you I will leave the PowerPoint with you afterwards, so don't worry. But essentially, here you have 4 papers of different projects I was personally involved. So, but in all these papers, you find extensive literature and references on value chains taken in one way or another. But the number one reference is taken is a chapter that I drafted together with colleagues for the handbook on global value chains, published 2 years ago, edited by Ponte and Greffi and Reichert. These 3 are some of the most best-known authors on value chains. And then, the journals where value chains studies are being published are typically the Review of International Political Economy, Research Policy, Industrial Corporate Change, the Journal of International Business, the Journal of Economic Geography, the Journal of International Business Policy, and so on. So, and the topics are many. The topic of value chain is being addressed by by different authors, taking the perspective of international trade, or taking the perspective of development economics and the impact of value chains on developing countries, or innovation, looking at innovation and value chains and interfirm relationships, or looking at the literature on international business and the strategy of multinational corporations and how they create a mechanism of outsourcing or offshoring or setting up value chains and the impact that these may have on their own performance as well as on the performance of their suppliers. So the field is really expanding in many different directions. And also international organizations have been writing a lot on value chains. So a huge and very relevant reference is the World Bank World Development Report 2020 on trade and value chains. And there you will find references to other World Bank publications, as well as the Asian Development Bank has been writing on value chains, as well as the WTO has remarkable pieces on value chains. So the literature is expanding rapidly. But here you have an initial reference or a starting point from which you can get a lot of additional information.
I had a question, Dr. Pietrobelli.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sort of the scout for searching in our group for searching for some of the key players in the research that's associated in your field. And I'm looking at some of the best universities or research centers around the globe. So maybe if you had an opinion about that, that would be great.
Working on value chains?
Yeah, so where's some of the key players located, research organizations, excluding, I would say, consulting firms, because they're always engaged in sort of analyzing global value chains, supply chains.
Yeah. As I was mentioning, there's, well, in terms of organizations and governments and so on, I think that the most active partner has been the World Bank in this regard.
Mm-hmm.
So look for the World Bank reports, the World Development Report. There's a name that is associated to a lot of work within the bank, a good friend of mine, Taglioni, Daria Taglioni. The surname is Taglioni, Taglioni, you would probably say. Mm-hmm. And they've been publishing a lot of different material and in different directions. But if you think in terms, and again, I mean, depending on what kind of perspective you take, traditionally, I would say that the inventor or the first intellectual to use the value chain terminology was Gary Gareffi from Duke University. That's the famous Duke Global Value Chain Center, directed by Gary Gareffi, who started writing about value chains in the 90s, essentially discovering that taking the stand of multinational corporations working in developing countries, and discovering that they were increasingly organizing their activities in a different fashion. So less vertical integration, more outsourcing, offshoring, and the leaders of these processes were not anymore, or were not mainly manufacturing firms, but in many cases they were traders. They were logistics companies or supermarket chains, or the J.C. Penney in the U.S., or the Walmart, or the Carrefour, or the big traders. And but then after a while, also scholars with a totally different background, focusing on international trade and international economics. And the most famous name there is Richard Baldwin. Baldwin is a professor, it's a US professor teaching in Geneva, in the Graduate Institute for International Affairs in Geneva. And Richard Baldwin started writing about value chains and trying to explain the process of a trade fragmentation that trade theorists were observing, and why trade was increasingly made of trade in intermediate goods instead of in finished goods. So any product would be fragmented into many different products, and these components would be the object of international trade as well. And he started explaining this as a process of fragmentation of production led by large corporations and essentially made possible by the ICT transformation. And he has data showing that the cost of transportation, the cost of transferring communication internationally has been falling to nearly zero. So from our computers, it would be easy to manage a plant in China without ever going there. Or perhaps you have your piece of land and you can irrigate it and plant it and so on from your desktop. And this kind of things that occur in the digital age. And so it was expanding the implications for international trade, and it's been publishing a number of papers on that. And there's a third slant of activity that is related to the industrial organization theory behind value chains. So interfirm contracts, and how do firms manage their network of relations, and why do they offshore or inshore or outsource, or all these terms that are related to having someone do something elsewhere or investing yourself in a foreign country, and all these contracts and networks and the strategy behind that. And there's a number of highly theoretical papers pioneered by a person named Paul Antras, Antras, who's a Spaniard professor at Harvard, publishing very, very theoretical and mathematical papers on all these issues. And then related to some of one strand and another one and so on, there are different authors, including myself, I would say, working at the intersection between value chains and trade and implications for developing countries. So a development kind of interest, wondering to what extent the existence or the evolution of these forms of organization would have an impact on local firms. And discovering, we started in the 90s, the Harvard book that I was mentioning before that we wrote some 15, 20 years ago was a book that came out of the realization that suppliers and firms in developing countries were facing different options, that entering international markets was increasingly difficult because the gatekeepers were larger firms. The standards, the requirements of international market were too high, and therefore, to be able to sell strawberries in London, you have to go through a big supermarket in London that would tell you what to export. Or I don't know. I remember a paradigmatic case of once I was in Uganda, and Uganda has this beautiful Victoria lake where they started growing flowers. They were starting growing roses. And they said, oh, we have wonderful roses. Let's go to Amsterdam and sell them. They went there and they didn't manage to sell a single rose. And why that? There was no system supporting that. There was no technology institution. They didn't know that they had to, that first of all, roses have different prices depending on the length of the stem and depending on the quality and how long they resist and so on, and the colors. And so it's highly complex. The prices are set in Amsterdam and nowhere else. And in order to export there and therefore export anywhere else, you need to be accepted that by that market, and you need to speak that language, and you need to be fluent with that technology. And to do that, you either have a system supporting you with labs. So they had to send samples of their soil to Amsterdam to be tested and back to Kampala. And they turned out to be so expensive that nobody could afford that, and they couldn't do anything. So either you have a system supporting producers, or you rely on international agents and buyers and trading companies and so on. So we started discovering that in countries like Uganda and many other developing countries, these lead firms and these forms of organization would provide the local suppliers with opportunities for accessing knowledge and acquiring standards and complying with the various certificates and so on. Otherwise, they would never get access to international markets. And so there's an entire branch of literature working on development and value chains, and the famous names are Gerefi himself and Rafi Kaplinsky, Kapli. If you browse through the handbook on global value chains, you see a lot of names, and many of the names I mentioned will be there. So I would start by looking at the handbook, and you find inspiration. And nowadays there's more and more issues related to, for example, climate change and value chains. Do firms integrating in value chains, are they likely to contaminate less and pollute less or more? And does being integrated in a value chain make a difference in terms of climate and environmental sustainability? Or there's another big branch of literature looking at the socio-economic implications of value chains, because value chain is also associated with very, very negative press. In many countries, value chains are exploitation, are making use of poorly paid women or children and child labor, and all this. And and then in part this is true. So there's this social dimension, these social aspects that are being increasingly studied. And there, if you're interested in these areas, the International Labour Office, ILO, is very active in studying social economic conditions, vulnerability, and value chains. Or there's others that are beginning to study subnational or local value chains, or value chains that are regional in Europe, or sometimes regional. I mean, some authors argue that value chains, global value chain is a misnomer, because most value chains are not global, they are regional. Most of the famous Asian brands are regional Asian value chains. And the Toshiba and Honda and Hyundai and I don't know, all these famous Japanese or Chinese names, they mainly produce in Asia. They don't produce anything, or they don't buy much from Africa, Latin America, or the US or Europe. And the same for the US to some extent. Mexico and Central America and a few countries here and there. But so there's others studying regional, and regional meaning beyond the country level, but working at Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on. And so it's an entire huge area of research that one can tackle in one way or another. I see. Thank you so much. Oh, you're welcome. You write to me if you need something more specific.
Yes, of course. It just seemed like, when you have when you have like a niche field like the one you study, it seems like wherever the people go, this universities automatically become famous for that. So I was just noting that down.
Yeah, Duke University is a good starting point. Or Geneva is another one.
Thank you so much.
I see a hand, Ebenezer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. I'd like to ask, in the earlier part of your presentation, it was evident that GVC has been growing from 1990 to 2017, and obviously even more after that. But there was another data which showed that Africa isn't performing well in this regard. And the North American Free Trade Agreement did have impacts as well in recent years. So you mentioned that you research a lot in the developing countries in terms of GVC. So my question is, in 2021, I think the beginning of this year, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was in full operation, but you realize that it's not been effective. So my question is, how long does it take if such strategies are being put in place to have an impact on value chain in maybe the region or globally? I don't know if my question is clear.
It is. It is. I mean, it's very broad. It's a hard. It's a big and hard question to answer. I would say that, I mean, first of all, let me make clear that in my mind, in my interpretation, the final target and the final objective, the general objective, is not the value chain itself, but the focus, in my mind, should be, or the final objective is using or adapting or making use of value chains as instruments, as tools to achieve economic, social development objectives. So I wouldn't assess a country as good or successful or unsuccessful if they are integrated or they're not integrated in a value chain. I mean, the development strategy can be totally different. And what we indeed observe in a big country like China is now that after having been integrated in value chains for several years, and after having been the factory of the world for many years, they've been exiting value chains. They've been getting out and withdrawing, and at the same time developing strong domestic capabilities and heavily investing in research, in development, and innovation, with the idea of eventually becoming themselves the leaders of value chains, leading themselves and building their own value chains. So the value chains in the Chinese case serve the purpose of helping Chinese firms to learn and innovate. But this was accompanied by a process of strengthening local innovation systems or regional or sectoral innovation system, massive and government commitment to promoting innovation in the country. So value chains are a tool. They're not the final target. Secondly, as far as Africa is concerned and the African Continental Agreement, this a trade agreement is mainly done with the aim of facilitating international trade. And therefore barriers are reduced. Non-tariff barriers are typically addressed. There's an effort to homogenize and standardize the rules, procedures, requirements, so that trade can develop, can be smoother, and can be easier. At the same time, the logic of value chains does not only reflect a trade logic, but it also reflects an enterprise strategy, an enterprise level or multinational corporation strategy. And therefore, having markets that are more open does not necessarily translate into a stronger integration in value chains. It could be that the business companies multinational corporations find it convenient not to integrate into value chains, or they lack additional elements and additional assets that are needed for them to find attractive to locate part of their activities in a country. And I'm referring to the system supporting enterprise development, the technology institutions, the technology supporting the rose growers in Uganda. An English supermarket like Marks and Spencer would not buy roses or strawberries from Kenya or Uganda unless, in addition to giving themselves support to the producers, unless there's also some extent of training facilities and technology support to the local enterprises. Otherwise, it may turn to be too costly to provide local enterprises with all the necessary support to help them reach the level that is required to operate in international markets. So, in other words, a trade agreement and greater trade openness can be a preliminary condition, if you wish, for integration in value chains. But at the same time, if the objective of a country as well as a firm is to capture the gains, that's one expression that's often been used in this kind of literature, capturing the gains, that is actually getting the benefits of being part of a value chain, not only being the factory of the world with underpaid workers and exploited children, but really adding value and increasing wages and retaining value. Then other things need to be done, and that's somehow related to what I can briefly introduce to you. But we're running a bit out of time. But if you like, I can spend some time telling you how I see GVC-oriented policies and how I think that it's very related to the discussion we're having now. I don't see more questions coming, so perhaps we can quickly switch to this Liu Chunfeng, please, and Vitaly and the lady there, right, please. No.
You're unmuted.
You're muted. Hello. Okay. Interesting. And can we group? I have the second question.
Yeah. My question, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
please.
I'm preparing a research for my term paper, and it is about the COVID-19 effects. So my question might be fancy, but I would like to know your opinion. How much the COVID-19 affects on industries, and what extent, and did they suffer from it, or maybe they even won in some cases?
All right, very good. Both questions are very relevant. Thank you. Is upgrading always good for countries? Try to remember the definition of upgrading we gave. That is product upgrading and process upgrading, which is essentially innovation in products and processes. and functional upgrading that is moving to other functions in the chain. So becoming capable of producing and selling something else be beyond what you used to do. Trying to put it very, very simply, very bluntly. So as far as the product and process upgrading, I would say that these are necessarily good by definition. I mean, improving productivity and improving and producing better and higher quality goods is a good thing for any country, for any firm. Though it may be convenient in specific industries and for specific firms to downgrade eventually, meaning producing goods that are not necessarily closer to the final market. Let me give you an example. I don't mean that if Argentina is a very large soybean exporter, it would be necessarily good for Argentina to become also a producer of soy bread and soy meat and soy-based meat and you know, and all the possible transformation of soy to get closer to final goods. It could also be convenient, and this of course depends on sectors and circumstances, but it could be convenient to go backward and eventually specialize in different varieties of soybeans, or using the genetic engineering that was used to produce soybeans and apply this capacity to other activities, or making use of the various inputs that are necessary to produce soybeans, or take the example of all the digital software that is behind what is known as a smart agriculture or digital agriculture that uses you know, the drones and software-based mechanisms to control and monitor and improve agriculture. Then this could be used for other activities, or could be used to improve the quality and the unit value of the beans that are produced. And that would itself be a process of improvement, of upgrading, but not necessarily moving towards the final market, to the finished goods market. I don't know if I've been clear. And policies can be very different. I mean, when we studied this in this paper that is the fourth paper in the list, where we explain the idea of a trifecta of GVC-oriented policy. We classified GVC-oriented policies in 4 different categories. The first one is participation. So the policy is oriented to get access to a value chain. And part of this policy is also making international trade easier, opening or harmonizing standards or improving customs functioning. So making it easier to trade internationally. And this can apply to any sector. These are typically, you know, sometimes regulatory improvements or horizontal measures that can apply to different sectors. But we also consider a second category of GVC-oriented policies that are policies oriented to capture value and help local firms to get advantage from value chain integration. And this may consist of traditional innovation policy for firms, or technology extension and technology transfer for firms, or human capital development policies for technical skills, for science and engineering skills. But in a value chain source with the value chain perspective. So not whatever skills or whatever innovation, but innovation that is relevant for capturing the gains from a value chain. That would often imply, for example, subsidizing investment in innovation, provided that these investments are designed in a collaborative fashion, engaging more than one firm and several firms along the chain, and making sure that the innovation is conducive to helping firms to get better access and improve and gain more and better advantages and value from the value chain. And in addition to these two categories, that is getting access to participation policies and secondly, value capture policies, we also single out two major and frequently employed policies. One is social development related to value chains. So making sure that value chains comply with the rules to make to let workers get a decent wage and to avoid exploitation, to fulfill a number of standards that aim at inclusion and social development in the countries of interest. And thirdly, and fourthly, a fourth category that has to do with resilience. And the word resilience became more and more fashionable with the COVID-19. So COVID has been exposing the world to terrible changes and disruptions, and firms as well as countries and governments have started thinking that their activities cannot be exposed to these kind of disruptions, that needs to be in place a mechanism that protects firms and countries from these disruptions. And for example, different theories have been going around saying that value chains should become shorter. So it's not realistic, and it only increases uncertainty and risk to source your intermediate goods from 100 countries. It's too many, because having 100 countries might increase the uncertainty and might increase the risk, because you rely on a number of factors that are not fully under control, and therefore the overall resilience, there's the capacity of the value chain to react and reorganize its activities can be in danger. And so some authors have been arguing that value chains are going to become shorter. Others are saying, no, it's not. This is not necessarily true, but some chains are being reorganized in order to be more smart. So taking into account the risk and uncertainty assessment, and better choosing suppliers, or better choosing sources, and therefore not necessarily reducing the number, but being more clever in monitoring and establishing a dialogue and understanding of which suppliers in which countries are more or less reliable. And concepts of resilience versus robustness have been considered, where robustness is a more technical term to highlight the need for a sort of engineering the robustness of the value chain. So if a supplier stops producing, then there should be another supplier producing the same thing that replaces the supplier that falls off. Whereas resilience reflects a more strategic way of considering the final objective, that is the objective of organizing production in a way that is smart enough to prevent and anticipate possible disruptions so that you do not necessarily replace a supplier with another supplier doing exactly the same thing and making sure that the value chain is robust enough. But you may, over time, build flexible value chains or modify the organization of value chains or diversify suppliers or ensuring monitoring mechanisms are more effective and aiming at capturing the overall result, that is making the organization of production at an international level flexible enough to assure the achievement of the final objective that is coming to the market and getting the goods in time and in the desirable quantity and quality. So a fourth area of policy interest is related to this idea of resilience and how to help firms and value chains and countries, again, depending on the perspective you use, whether you're thinking in terms of a country level or a sector and value chain level or a firm level, then all these terms can mean slightly different things, and policies can make sense to a different extent. No? So to answer the impact of COVID-19, I've somehow already hinted at that. It's I do not think that we are going to observe a major de-globalization process. I think that there's a number of features that are structural, and moving backwards is going to be very hard. At the same time, I'm pretty sure that value chains, they are already reorganizing their activities. And therefore, different strategies prevailing, and it would be very interesting to study also from the point of view of case studies and then business cases to understand how different multinational corporations of different value chains are reacting to the COVID and to the challenges posed, but it's sure that they already reacting, they're already changing their activities. So in some cases, they are, there's this concept that gained popularity in Europe, that is this near sourcing. That is the idea that, say, a German firm that used to buy its inputs from a blend of producers from Poland, Estonia, and Kazakhstan, former Soviet countries, but relatively nearby to German producers, and China, for example, they may end up sourcing more locally. So instead of buying more from China, they would perhaps move back part of their productions and part of their sourcing strategy from China or Korea to Poland and Germany. Is this happening? This has been advocated by several European Union policymakers and European governments as a policy to foster the process of industrialization of Europe that has been suffering from remarkable deindustrialization. A lot of activities went abroad, and a lot of areas in Europe have been deserted by industry. So governments have been proposing that in order to revitalize industry, it would be useful, especially in this period of COVID and this period of hindrances to international trade, to source back and ensure near the headquarters. I did some preliminary study trying to study this hypothesis of near sourcing and backshoring for Latin America to study to what extent Latin America could become a new alternative for U.S. corporations that used to buy a lot from China, and eventually, in the case of U.S.-China trade wars and pandemic and so on, they could decide to buy from nearby Mexico or Costa Rica than from China. but we did not find much evidence that this is actually happening. This is something that some firms are beginning to develop, but not that much. I mean, from what we've seen so far. I'm already anticipated some of the results of our policy-related work. I don't know whether you have more questions or remarks. Let me share before we conclude. Let me share one slide with you, and that can help me to perhaps wrap up a bit and leave you with some messages. Look, this is something, I mean, if you're interested and you read the paper, you will find a lot of details in the final paper that came out in the Journal of International Business Policy. And that's available online, that's for free and open access and so on. These are the 4 categories of GVC oriented policies. We studied and discussed a bit the why, the justification. Why would the government need to spend money and time to design and implement these kind of policies? And the examples of these policies or instruments or concrete policy tools are those that you see in the table. So you see that the first row, the GVC participation policies, are essentially horizontal measures that would apply to all sectors, that would improve transport and digital infrastructures, that would facilitate international trade and eliminate trade obstacles, and so on. And as you move down to value capture, you see that interventions tend to be more specific to specific sectors, strengthening local innovation systems, local production systems, improving specific infrastructures, improving the agricultural technology institutions for rose productions or for other segments of the value chain that the country may be endowed with, or develop specific skills or develop linkages between universities, technology centers, vocational and training centers in a way that is consistent, that is relevant for the value chain. Or, and you go down, inclusiveness policies, and you see examples, responsible sourcing policies, standard promotion, involvement of local communities in GVC governance, and finally the GVC resiliency policies. You may say that most of these policies are already in place and they are the same traditional policies we already have. So what's the difference in terms of, this is a GVC policy related to trade, would be an international trade policy. Where is the novelty? And what we argue is that the novelty is essentially in this trifecta, in these 3 dimensions that make GVC-oriented policies somewhat different, even if they rely on very similar approaches and very similar instruments, but they are novel to some extent. First of all, there's a focus on tasks, on specific functions, instead of thinking of the entire industry. We need a policy to help develop the auto industry. Nowadays, a statement like this would make no sense. The auto industry is made of the glass industry, the electronics industry, the rubber industry, the metal industry, the metalworking, the capacity to assemble, the logistics, and so on. So policies need to move down to a specific, to a finer definition of tasks and functions, and target those functions and those tasks. So not anymore big sectors, but go finer. Secondly, linkages matter a lot, and the emphasis of all policies needs to be on improving linkages, strengthening linkages, ensuring local firms interact with multinational corporations, with foreign buyers, with universities and technology suppliers. Policies need to have a special perspective on linkages that need to be maintained. The example of innovation subsidies that could be designed as a GVC-oriented policy would be an example of a policy where the subsidy is also conditional on the setting up of the existence of a relationship, of a linkage, of an interaction among different actors that is consistent with the value chain logic. And third dimension, the focus needs to be at the very micro level on firms. In some cases, these firms are the objective of the analysis, the object of the policy can be lead firms, so that the largest firms that orchestrate the network of transactions and relationships, and sometimes these lead firms can be engaged in policy design and policy implementation. Think of disseminating fair and decent labor practices among small suppliers in developing countries. I mean, a partnership with large companies, Nestlé, Nespresso, or Levi's, or JC Penney, or Walmart, and engaging them in making sure that their suppliers will be complying with labor standards, with non-exploitative measures, and so on. So there's a room for firm-specific approaches, but also a firm-specific as the perspective should take into account the logic and the perspective of improvement of local suppliers, of local small and medium-sized firms. So designing policies that take the microeconomic dimension, how firms develop, how they improve, how they learn, how they innovate, and putting in place mechanisms that within the logic of a value chain would aim at strengthening and fostering the innovation and learning in firms integrated in the value chain. So this trifecta dimension, a focus on tasks, a focus on linkages, and finally on firms, are elements, are areas of interest and emphasis that make GVC-oriented policies different from the traditional trade and industrial or labor market policies. I think that these are the main messages that I wanted to convey. I don't know whether you have additional questions or whether you may consider my availability if you need some specific support or reference or idea for your assignments. I'll thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. It was a great lecture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good luck with your studies. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.